Great, so we are live now. So I'd like to say good afternoon to everyone and welcome to this Bright Blue event entitled Core Strength, Nuclear and Net Zero in partnership with EDF. My name is Rebecca Foster. I'm an energy and environment researcher at Bright Blue and the event chair for today. So for those of you that may not know, Bright Blue is an independent, liberal, conservative think tank, and one of our major research themes is energy policy. We are joined today by a virtual audience who can ask questions during the event by using the Slido link found both in the description box on the YouTube link and on the Eventbrite page. Or you can tweet at @WeAreBrightBlue and using the hashtag #BrightBlue to submit your questions. Today's discussion is focused around the debate of what role nuclear power will or should play in Britain's transition to net zero. So as we move away from burning fossil fuels, it's clear that the UK will need to increase its energy supply and deliver net zero. So in 2020, around 16% of the UK's electricity came from nuclear power plants, compared to wind contributing 24.8. However, the UK government has recently announced in its net zero strategy, new nuclear, which is set to play a significant role in our energy system. So the UK is investing 1.7 million towards new large-scale stations, 120 million for a future nuclear enabling fund, 385 million for advanced nuclear fund, and backing the Rolls-Royce small modular reactors. However, sceptics hold reservations, particularly around the economic viability of nuclear, its lack of flexibility, and potentially sustainability, such as dealing with the nuclear waste. Here today to discuss this topic, we have our excellent panelists, who I will very shortly introduce, and who will each give a 5-minute speech on nuclear and its role in our energy system. Afterwards, I will get the discussion going, and then you'll be able to pose your questions to the panelists. So we are joined here today by Mark Jenkinson, who is the Conservative MP for Workington, Vice Chair of the Nuclear Energy APPG, Dr. Simon Evans, who is the Carbon Brief's Deputy Editor and Policy Editor, Sir Robin Grimes, who is the Professor of Materials Physics at Imperial College London, and Paul Spence, Director of Strategy and Corporate Affairs at EDF. So Mark, please could you kick us off with your 5-minute speech?
Thank you, Rebecca. So I came into Parliament in 2019 on a Conservative manifesto commitment to support nuclear energy and to reaching net zero by 2050. As the policies for the latter take shape, I'm delighted to see the former also come to the fore. At a recent industry gathering, I was pleased to hear that the industry are more positive about the future of UK nuclear power than in recent decades. We have a far more pro-nuclear ministerial team than ever before in my adult life. In Tony Blair's valedictory speech to Labour Party conference, he said, 10 years ago, I parked the issue of nuclear power. Today, I believe without it, we're going to face an energy crisis, and we can't let that happen. Today, we have a Labour front bench that would allow that to happen. Recent moves by them would have prevented investment that we're currently seeing from the likes of EDF. With Hinkley Point C under construction, we started in this Parliament with a commitment to taking one large-scale nuclear plant to final investment decision. We've got industry interest in Sizewell C, in Moorside and in Wilverneworth. We've committed, as you've previously said, to small modular reactors, with Rolls-Royce aiming not only for 16 UK reactors, but also for a UK factory base and supply chain, creating high-value, sustainable jobs, producing products that will be exported globally for many decades to come. We've committed recently to a high-temperature gas reactor as our technology of choice for our advanced modular reactor R&D programme, and to having a demonstration by the early 2030s. We've got a short list of 5 sites for the STEP programme, which aims to build a prototype fusion power plant here in the UK by 2040. And shortly, we'll be welcoming a nuclear roadmap from the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. And just an aside, I sit on the BEIS Select Committee, as well as being the Vice Chair of the APPG. The Committee on Climate Change's 6 carbon budget is clear in the need for another large-scale nuclear power plant by 2035, in addition to Hinkley Point C, at Sizewell C and Sizewell B, which will still be generating. But as we decarbonise heating and transport, demands on the grid will only grow, and with it will grow our demand for firm power for baseload. We're going to have to reimagine our energy system, which at the minute relies on frequency response, using quickly deployable technologies such as gas to fill gaps of undersupply. Nuclear delivers firm power at a constant output, while all renewables are inherently volatile. Last night, for example, from an installed capacity of over 37 gigawatts, solar was producing 0, as you might imagine, and wind 1.1 gigawatt hours. We had to call on coal to fill the shortfall, burning 300 kilograms a second, while spot prices reach £4,000 a megawatt hour. From 2024, coal will not be an option, and so neither is inaction. To my mind, I see us moving to a system that can cope with oversupply, for example, using frequency diversion to processes such as hydrogen production, alongside a smart grid that can store, release, and alter power requirements as the grid demands. Nuclear is a proven technology, the lowest carbon technology with the lowest environmental footprint, and with the current fleet generating at just £45 a megawatt hour. When we factor in the cost of construction to get something resembling a levelized cost, it is comparable to offshore wind before we factor in its reliability. It will be half or just over the levelized cost of some of our largest offshore wind farms currently operating. And their published costs don't account for other costs across the grid arising from their unpredictability and volatility. A diverse energy mix is essential, one that delivers energy security and value for money. There is still significant room for new renewables and new renewable generation methods, but at the heart of our energy mix going forward must be new nuclear in significant quantities.
Great, thank you very much. I just wanted to pick up on one point you made there about how in your lifetime, we've never been so pro-nuclear until today. So this is the most pro we've been. What do you think the main driver is behind this shift in our mindset that actually nuclear is an option? Because we've known about nuclear, it's not actually a new technology. What has changed to really make us decide actually we should have invested in nuclear? And do you think we should have invested in nuclear many, many years ago?
So to answer the last question first, yes, I do believe we should have invested long before today. The constituency next to mine, Copeland, was home to the first nuclear power station in the UK. We should have invested long before today. Tony Blair, like I said, back in 2006, would it be 2007, alluded to the fact that they should have been doing a lot more on it at the time. We have been, you know, Hinkley Point C, I think, wasn't a great advertisement for government negotiations on nuclear power, and I think that was a bit of a sticking point going forward that made us a bit more fearful, I think, of negotiating new nuclear contracts. But we've got the financing bill going through now that will allow institutional investment. I think this is the key to unlocking where we should have been arguably some time ago, but at least, you know, the second, if the best time for nuclear was yesterday, then the second best time is today. So.
Great. Well, thank you for putting your points forward and starting us off. I'll next turn to Simon, please, for your introductory remarks. And Simon is going to share his screen with some slides he's prepared as well. So, go.
Hopefully you can see that now.
Yep.
Great. Yeah, so thanks very much, Rebecca, for the introduction. Yeah, so I'm just very briefly introduce Carbon Brief for those of you that don't know us. We're a grant-funded journalistic outfit. We cover climate change and energy, particularly as it relates to emissions and climate and warming. I should say that we're kind of furiously independent and neutral in the sense that we don't take policy positions on anything, and that does include nuclear. However, I have put together what I hope is going to be some useful points about what position nuclear is seen to play in the UK mix and how that's shifted over time. So I looked back to the carbon plan from 2011. So this is looking back a decade, and at that time, obviously, it was the coalition government, and the Liberal Democrats were, let's say, sceptical about nuclear at that time. Nevertheless, interesting to see how that government plan talked about the role of nuclear in terms of the UK's future energy mix. And they basically kind of didn't make a decision. They said that it was going to be a mix of CCS, renewables and nuclear, and that they would see which one was cheapest in the 2020s. Well, we are now in the 2020s, so you might reasonably ask which one is the cheapest. And so this chart shows how the government's own projections of costs have changed over time. So you can see there's 3 different bars for each technology. So the dark grey bar is what the government thought technologies would cost as of 2013. 2016 is the grey bars, and the red ones show the latest Bayes estimates for the levelized cost of different technologies. And what you can see is a reflection of the global shift in technology costs, particularly for renewables, where offshore, onshore, and large-scale solar have all come down massively in cost in terms of how much they cost to generate each unit of electricity. I should say on the nuclear side there that the government actually just didn't update those estimates, and obviously EDF, Rolls-Royce, and so on would argue that significantly lower costs are possible, and obviously that remains to be seen. So now turning to the net zero strategy, obviously published last year, I think is a really interesting shift in how the government speaks about the future energy mix, which obviously reflects the previous slide, the changing cost estimates. So it's now saying, the government's now saying that a low cost net zero electricity system is most likely predominantly wind and solar. But on the other hand, because those are intermittent, they're weather dependent, those technologies will need to be complemented by things like nuclear, CCS, and so on. So I think, there's still obviously very strong government support for nuclear, but it's in a very different role to how it was envisaged previously, where it was seen as central to the mix. So in terms of what that means for how much nuclear the government is envisaging, so back a decade ago, they were saying 10 to 15 gigawatts of nuclear by 2030. So obviously we're at about roughly 8 gigawatts now, I believe. Most of that's due to retire, save for Sizewell B. So 10 to 15 gigawatts would have been a lot. And they were saying even up to 20 gigawatts would have been achievable if build rates had increased. Now, obviously that's not going to happen at this stage. Interesting also to see that the government thought 35 to 50 gigawatts for renewables. Now compare that to what Bayes is saying in its current projections. Notably, these are the baseline projections. So this is what it thinks would happen without the policies in the net zero strategy. So these numbers could change a little bit, but it's basically a baseline for nuclear of 4 gigawatts by 2030, which is basically Sizewell B plus Hinkley C. And for renewables, not even including the offshore wind target that Boris Johnson announced in his 10-point plan, they're talking about 78 gigawatts. So that's like a really massive shift in the balance between the different technologies. And just in case you were thinking that's merely a UK shift in position, this is quite a long quote, but just to basically to emphasize that this is very much, the government view as it stands today in the net zero strategy is very much of a piece with what the IEA said in its latest World Energy Outlook last November. And they basically said across all scenarios, so all of the different ways for reaching net zero by 2050, variable renewables, in other words, wind and solar, make up a very large proportion of the electricity mix. And again, they point to a different but nevertheless important role for nuclear and other dispatchable low carbon technologies. Just a final slide, just to emphasize this, it's not just the IEA, it's not just the government in the UK. BP publishes an energy outlook every year. And this graph basically shows how that outlook has changed over the last decade. And you can see pretty much without fail, every time they publish a new outlook, they increase their forecast for renewable deployment. And conversely, they decrease their forecast for nuclear. So again, that merely reflects the changing economic prospects of the different technologies. Now, as I said, we don't take a position on what that should or shouldn't mean for the UK, but hopefully some useful background.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much. What I wanted to go to was one of the first graphs, if you could flick back possibly, comparing the cost.
Yeah.
Just a bit more information on what has driven the cost of renewables down and why has nuclear remained the same, or simply why is nuclear so expensive?
I will defer to the undoubtedly much more expert panelists in terms of nuclear costs. Mm-hmm. And I think they may well argue that the costs in this chart aren't reflective of what could be achieved. In terms of renewables, I mean, that's basically your standard learning curves, and technologies coming down the learning curve much more quickly than people expected, basically because deployment was quicker than expected. Obviously, renewables are modular technologies in the sense that you can deploy small amounts. And you learn how to improve the process, the deployment, whether it's how to deploy an offshore wind turbine at sea, or what kind of vessel you use to do that, or whether it's the factory making solar panels. You can improve that incrementally over time. I think the other really important factor, which also speaks to nuclear, is about the cost of capital. Effectively, government schemes such as the Contracts for Difference in the UK have de-risked investment in things like offshore wind. So a developer can borrow money at maybe 3 or 4% to build their offshore wind farm. And because low carbon technologies, they don't have to buy fuel, or almost even for nuclear, almost all of the cost is up front. And that means that the cost of capital to actually get the thing built is a huge determinant of how expensive it is overall. So as the cost of borrowing has come down for these projects, so too as the cost of delivering that electricity.
Oh, that's great. Thanks for clarifying that. I just want to say before we move on to our next speaker, do submit your questions via the Slido link if you do have any, and this is to our online audience. That would be great. Thank you very much, Simon. I'm going to move on now to Robin, please, for your 5 minutes.
Thanks very much. I'm just going to check everybody can hear me okay.
Yep.
Good. Anyway, you gave us 4 questions, and I thought I would just literally rattle through them and then give some justifications. I suppose you would expect that from an academic. Anyway, the first one is nuclear power cost-effective pathway to decarbonising the electricity grid. Well, of course, it's not just about the electricity grid. It's about decarbonisation of our needs for electricity, or rather, I should say, our increased needs for electricity, our increased to decarbonise transport, and our decarbonisation of our need for heat. And it's all of those things together. And remembering at the moment that electricity is about 20%, 25% of our needs, that's clearly going to go up a considerable amount. So we're trying to aim there at a bit of a moving target. So we need to consider decarbonisation of the whole of our needs. The second thing was, how will competition with renewables impact the building of new nuclear capacity? Well, that would be a disaster. If we think that nuclear is going to be in competition with renewables, then I'm afraid I don't really think that that's going to work very well at all. We have to, as our other 2 speakers have already talked about, is consider how nuclear is part of an overall energy mix. And I'm really going to go into that in a little bit more detail in a moment. And then the issue of, can new nuclear be delivered without ballooning costs? Well, this is about, again, and our last speaker, I think, gave a really interesting set of comments. It's about a systems and engineering systems-based approach. And it's not just an engineering system-based approach for how nuclear contributes to the grid, but also a systems-based approach for the manufacturing processes. It's also a systems approach of how you make decisions of how you're going to build a resilient system. And at the moment, I would argue we are very quickly getting into a position where we have definitely not a resilient system, and certainly not a system that's heading towards decarbonisation by 2050. And then finally, the question of the impact of small modular reactors on increasing capacity. And I would say that is a part of the solution. It's actually a critical part of the solution, but we have small modular reactors based on the kinds of technologies that we're used to at the moment, which have output temperatures of around, 300 or something like that centigrade. But actually, we also need small modular reactors or advanced modular reactors that are going to lead us to these new technologies associated with production of hydrogen, of synthetic fuels, of ammonia. In other words, using the heat directly, which is much more efficient to do chemistry that we need to do in order to decarbonize those other parts of the problem. Now, actually, when you use a nuclear reactor, of course, and again, previous two speakers have mentioned this, we are looking at a constant amount of energy produced. But that constant amount of energy produced also produces about 65% of lost waste heat. So immediately, there's an awful lot of things that we can do with that waste heat. And I think our next speaker might talk about that a little bit more. So I won't go into that detail, I promise. But in addition to that, it's not just about the waste heat. As I say, it's about using the heat more efficiently to contribute to the types of technologies that require high temperatures. So if we think about glass and cement manufacture, for example, you're not really get going till you're above 800 degrees centigrade. So that's clearly a quite different challenge, but one that we have to meet if we're going to reach net zero. Then there are sort of intermediate temperatures, things like production of petrochemicals, methane reforming, steam electrolysis at higher temperatures, which again makes the hydrogen production more efficient. So you can see that what I'm arguing here is a sort of a system within systems approach that we need to take, a smart way of using large reactors, small modular reactors, advanced modular reactors, leading eventually to our ability to have the technologies in place that will allow us to make use of fusion, because fusion is also a high temperature output technology. Of course, we're looking quite a way into the future, and frankly, probably beyond the 2050, when we needed to have solved our current challenge. And I'm going to stop just there. Actually, I should probably say the Royal Society has been producing a lot of reports associated with something called the Low Carbon Energy Programme, and I recommend people go to that. And there is actually one on nuclear cogeneration. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Robin. Quite a detailed and technical take on things, which, if you don't mind, I can ask you just to clarify some of those terminologies you use for myself and our audience as well. So first, could you explain a little bit more about why we need small modular reactors, and what the difference is between that and an advanced modular reactor and a large modular reactor? Because to the lay audience, nuclear is nuclear. So what are the categories? Thank you.
So there are two things here. The reactors that are being built at the current time are really going to give us much more of that baseload capacity, and frankly, it's going to replace the baseload capacity that's stopping at the moment. And that is designed to raise steam, to turn turbines, to generate electricity. Now, the small modular reactors gives us more flexibility in the system, so that we can have those reactors more dedicated to perhaps producing synthetic fuels, doing lower temperature but still quite hot electrolysis to produce hydrogen. Hydrogen is a feedstock chemical for so many different things that we do from making polymers, but making synthetic fuels, zero carbon jet fuel, for example, lots of things that we do with hydrogen. But many of those technologies require much higher temperatures because the chemistry goes on at higher temperatures. So if we can have an advanced modular reactor, which has output temperatures at 700 degrees, then we're in a position to use the heat directly to do the chemistry, and that's more efficient. The other thing I should say that the small modular reactors give us is the ability to develop a UK nuclear engineering supply chain, which is something I'm afraid that we've rather lost, and we need to reconstitute very quickly. And I know there's a lot of people, including people here, who are trying to help on that.
Great, thanks for going over those points. And also, if you don't mind explaining the term baseload energy, because it's important that we have a baseload energy. I know that it's part of our supply. However, yes, consumption does change over time. It does. And flexibility is important. So I understand your point on the importance of having small modular reactors to help this flexibility. But do you think that actually nuclear doesn't allow for flexibility, and that's a con in a way?
Well, look, there is a certain amount of electricity, there's a certain amount of energy that we need all the time. It's a constant, it's that base upon which all the other variations sit. And that base can be produced by nuclear at that constant rate. And it's a very efficient way of using the energy produced by conventional and large nuclear reactors. Now, at the moment, we have a base about this much because it's only about the electricity. But as we decarbonize, we have a requirement for synthetic fuels for producing heat for direct use. Actually, the base load will increase. So we will have more need for reactors just to be creating that electricity, which will allow us to do more of that work.
Mm-hmm. So what about other forms of base load energy that we could use? Do you think, for example, we could have geothermal heat, interconnectedness from abroad coming in and supporting us for our base load energy, or maybe pumped hydro that can be deployed intermittently? What about these other uses? Do you still think there's a place for those?
Right, so pumped hydro, I don't know whether anybody's ever been to De Norwig and seen it. It's truly awesome. It's extremely expensive, and it's only used when you have those really high little peaks where the return for the investment is absolutely tremendous. And that's what makes the economics for pumped storage work. Geothermal, we really don't have very good quality heat in the UK, so we would have to get something in from Iceland or something like that. And there are then all sorts of discussions to have about not only the engineering of getting that all the way from Iceland, but also the geological instabilities associated with doing something like that. But the interconnectivity between ourselves and Norway and in fact, if you look at the electricity, where we're getting electricity from over the last 48 hours, it's been mostly gas. And actually, as well as the coal that we've also been burning, and also the wood pellets that we've been burning, actually we've been getting, without the interconnectivity between Norway, France and Belgium, we'd be sitting in the dark.
Great, thanks very much, Robin. I'll now move on to our next speaker. Paul, please, could you take us away with your 5 minutes?
Thank you, Rebecca. And I mean, just to start back at one of the points you made, that nuclear isn't a new technology. I mean, in fact, nuclear has been an important part of the UK energy system for nearly 6 decades now. And today, as you said, it's producing enough power to meet about 15% of what we need nationally. And that's already down from where it was at peak. At the highest point, it was about a bit over a quarter of our power was coming from nuclear. But what it does do today is going to carry on being essential for us as we go on the decarbonisation journey through the 2020s. And I can summarize why it's important in three terms: is affordability, always on, and it's low carbon. And the need for that's never been any stronger than it is today. So let me just say a bit more about all three of those. So first of all, we need an energy system, we know, for 2035, electricity system for 2035 to get to a net zero economy by 2050. And that means we need twice as much low carbon electricity. So twice as much electricity, 4 times as much of that to be low carbon. And we know that including nuclear alongside renewables, is far and away the best way to achieve that system at the best price. So, that affordability word. And we heard Simon talked about the COP26 conference in Glasgow. We heard during that conference an increasing international view that nuclear is an essential part of that low carbon mix, what the government has said in its low carbon plan. Why do they say that? Well, nuclear doesn't depend on the weather. When it's running, it produces that power 24 hours a day, 365 days of the year. And modelling from lots of different sources, including the International Energy Agency, including our own Committee on Climate Change, lots of bodies say that a system that has an element of nuclear is cheaper than a system without nuclear. And to give one example of the scale of that potential, having nuclear in the mix, about a £5 billion saving on the total system for UK consumers, compared to a system where you rule nuclear out as an option. And that's based on the sort of modelling that the government-based economists do. The second reason is that we need new nuclear is that despite billions of pounds of money invested in the existing fleet, they are closing. 7 of the 8 existing nuclear stations are going to stop generating electricity before the end of this decade, before the end of the 2020s. And that includes, one example, Hunterston B. The second reactor at Hunterston B finished its 46 years of generation at the start of this year, and its sister station, Hinkley Point B, will finish its generation this year as well. So we're on a declining path with the existing nuclear power stations. And yeah, we've made a start on the replacement. We've made a good start at Hinkley Point C on the construction of that next generation of stations. About 22,000 people at the moment in this country working on the project, in some of those high quality jobs that Robin talked about, in engineering, in manufacturing, in construction, helping to rebuild that UK skills base in nuclear and in broader engineering. And those people are also showing that the UK's got the know-how to deliver new nuclear. We know how to do this for real. I think another reason that we should be valuing nuclear, I would argue at the moment, is the price crisis that we and the rest of Europe are seeing at the moment over the last several months. Nuclear is a sovereign energy source. We control the operation of those stations in the UK. We don't, it reduces the reliance that we have on those volatile international, sometimes uncertain gas supplies and gas markets. And we've seen over the period since last summer a sharp, not just a one-off, but a persisting increase in international gas prices. Prices up 5 or 6 times, sometimes 7 times higher than they were at the start of last year. And that's caused electricity prices to spiral. I mean, if Simon was to draw some of those pictures he showed earlier with today's gas prices, it would look very different for a carbon capture and storage project, just as an example. But in the short term, that's really hurting British households and British businesses. And we're all today worrying about what's going to happen with the next price increase that's due to be announced, probably hundreds of pounds more on the gas prices for households. And that's why we think that as a country, we need to move forward with more new nuclear, starting with Sizewell C in Suffolk. The government's term is before the end of this Parliament, I would say as soon as possible. Part of the reason that the trajectory about the growth of nuclear moves backwards is if we don't start building them, we don't finish building them to have them contribute to the power. So we really do need to get on with it. Sizewell will produce about 7% of UK demand, the same number of direct jobs in engineering, about 3 times that number when you add in the indirect jobs associated. It'll help insulate Britain and Britain's consumers from the costs of imported energy. And I think it's an unarguable part of a future system. And as Robin said, the progression from large-scale nuclear reactors to smaller modular reactors to the advanced reactors to provide heat to fusion is a natural path if we decide nationally it's a path that we want to go on to. But it's the way to have affordable, reliable, always on, low carbon power. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Brilliant. I have something to pose to you, picked up from one of your last sentences, actually. You said, if we decide to go to nuclear. And I just wondered whether, what's the public's attitudes towards nuclear? How do you think that's changed over time? And do you think there still is room for more education around nuclear and the risks associated with it, and the advantages of it to help create this movement?
I mean, in general, Rebecca, there has been pretty stable support, acceptance, whatever word you want, for the role of nuclear. There's been some relatively low awareness of the role that nuclear does play, but when people know and understand that, they have been about 2/3 of people, sometimes a little bit more, sometimes a little bit less, have seen the value of the role of nuclear plays as part of a low carbon mix. What's interesting is that the support tends to be broadly accepting nationally. When you get to the communities around the nuclear power stations, what you see is not a reduction, but an increase in the support. The people who live around the stations know how safe the operation is because they see the people, they see that for real. And they also see the economic benefit that comes from those stations. So you see a step up in those communities because they're less worried about the things. We know that the questions that the public ask about nuclear are, is it safe? Are there risks to security from an attack? And what are you doing about the waste that you are producing? They are the 3 questions that predominantly get asked. If you live near a power station, you have a 4th question, which is when it's being built, what's the impact on my life going to be of all these people in my community and all the disruption? I would argue that yes, we have to have a dialogue with the public and with the communities about those 4 questions, and we need to help people see how safe nuclear really is, because it is demonstrably much safer than perception would perhaps suggest. We need to show that we know how to manage the waste that we produce, because there are relatively small volumes and we do manage it very safely and well. And we need to talk respectfully to the communities we ask to host nuclear power stations about the implications for them during the big construction phase. But if we do all of those things, support is there and can grow.
Great, thank you very much for answering that. I'm actually receiving lots of questions coming in from our virtual audience via the Slido. So thank you. So one of our first questions is from Rear Admiral Mike Herwitt. And he has a couple of questions, so I'll just read them out. What's missing in the UK's energy security and why? What specific actions can be taken now to get the UK where it needs to be in order to achieve energy security? And the other question is, given that the UK's energy security is under crunch, how could we accelerate the deployment of nuclear SMRs, such as the Rolls-Royce units. So if I could go to Robin and Mark, if you'd like to come in on that one as well.
Sure, and I think Paul would have quite a few things to say there as well. And I'm afraid actually the answer is really quite simple, and that is we just need to get on with it. We need to ensure that we have the right incentives in order to progress the engineering challenges. You know, we've got to get these technologies so that they are acceptable to the regulator. I mean, we haven't really talked about the regulator yet, but one of the reasons, you know, that Paul quite rightly points out, that, you know, we've been producing electricity via nuclear here for a very, very long time indeed. And part of the reason for that is we have a very robust regulator. Well, it takes time to go through that process and convince, quite rightly, the regulator that it's the right site, it's the right technology, the right concerns have been met, and that you also at the same time have taken the local population. It just takes time. So the answer is get on with it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. If you'd like to chime in, Paul or Mark.
Yeah, so Robin's just hit the nail on the head for the second question. SMRs, we do need to look at the licensing and the genetic design assessment process and the development consenting process, and I understand that they probably will be looked at or are being looked at as we speak. And there is a reason that Rolls-Royce are setting their sights on existing nuclear sites for that community acceptance initially. And then the first question about we're going to hit a bump in the road. Nuclear takes quite a few. Hinkley Point C will come online in a few years, but then we're going to have another gap whereby our only real solution is to fill it with gas, whether that is unabated or otherwise is obviously up for significant discussion. CCUS is unproven, but you know, there's an adult conversation that we're going to have between now and our second and third large-scale nuclear power plants coming online.
Can I add to that and perhaps also answer a little bit of the question you were asking earlier about how do you achieve cost reductions? Because I think there's evidence and experience, you know, whether I look in France, whether I look in China, whether I look in Korea, about how do you accelerate the pace of deployment of nuclear, and also how do you do the same thing that was brilliantly achieved by the onshore and offshore wind industry, which is to take the costs down. You do it by having a stable design and by repeating that design and by doing it in a programmatic way, so you know up front that you are going to, after the first one has got to a certain point, you're going to start the second one, and after that one's gone, you've got the third one and the fourth one and the fifth one. And by doing that and by moving people between and by organizing your manufacturing systematically, as Robin said, in that world, you can first of all accelerate your delivery, and you can secondly drive down the costs massively. Not just the direct cost of delivery, but also the risk in delivery, because you've got a proven team that know what they're doing and keep doing it. And that means that the people who provide the finance are more confident that you can do it. And therefore the financing cost is lower as well. So you get into a virtuous circle. We've seen that in the wind industry. We've seen that elsewhere in the world in the nuclear industry. So far, the UK hasn't done that. But there is no reason why we can't do that in future.
Thank you very much. Another question come in here, anonymous. So would you agree that HMG needs to commit to more than one new large-scale nuclear power plant in this government if it wants to meet its 2035 net zero goals? Maybe Simon, if you could come in here and put your thoughts across on whether you think we need more bigger nuclear, or there's something else we could be using.
Yeah, thanks for that anonymous one. look, as I said at the start, I'm not going to give my personal view. We try to be neutral. What I can do is point to the government's National Infrastructure Commission. They wrote a letter of advice to Kwasi Kwarteng just before Christmas on specifically this question. So he had asked whether an additional new nuclear plant beyond Sizewell C was needed to deliver the sixth carbon budget, which is centering on the period 2035. And they said the Commission's view is that it is not. So, you know, as I said, it's not for me to say, that's what they said. Others may disagree.
Great, thank you. Another anonymous question come in that I'm going to ask Paul to answer, please. While the government has committed significant funds to small modular reactors, is it true that this technology is not yet ready to be deployed and will not be ready by 2030?
I think what is true, and I mean, Robin talked about it, is that the small modular, you know, particularly the UK small modular reactor is going through the process with the regulator at the moment, and is going through the detailed engineering work that it needs to do in order to satisfy itself, you know, to satisfy the regulator that the design is complete and ready and safe in every dimension. So that work needs doing. We've also seen the work to identify the manufacturing sites for the small modular program. I know that the team working on that program have some very ambitious timetables to be ready for deployment by 2030 on both fronts. And their expectation is that once they have a design and once that's approved and once they have sites and once they have manufacturing, then the construction phase can be quicker, so we can start building them faster. Nuclear, probably. I can't remember who it was that pointed out that the expectation of what Simon was talking about, nuclear and its contribution before 2030. Well, because we haven't started, we won't have got them finished for 2030. But you know, we don't finish in 2030, we don't finish in 2035. We need to decarbonise the whole economy by 2050. And as Robin said, that means a lot of electricity and a lot of heat that needs us to push ahead this decade on all of them to deliver what we need for that longer term piece as well. Which I think is where I would slightly disagree with Simon about should we push ahead with more this Parliament or with the National Infrastructure Commission. I think it's because of what I look out and see beyond the sixth carbon budget into the periods after that tells me that we should be moving faster now, and we shouldn't be saying what I hear said now, which is, I wish that we'd started 20 years ago on our new nuclear programme because we'd be further ahead by now. The best time for the decisions is now, and the time to take them on, not just one more, but some more, is now.
Can I actually add a little bit to that? You know, this sort of issue of how much nuclear do we need and the various recommendations. And of course, there are many different recommendations which come to quite different conclusions. But in particular, if you don't have, I think it's always very interesting to ask the question, so what if you don't end up with a lot more nuclear contributing in a flexible way to dealing with the intermittency of renewables and the increasing penetration of renewables into our entire energy grid? And the answer is you do have to have a number of additional technologies, in particular CCS, which have also not reached a level of maturity that enables you to have confidence that they will be able to deliver. So I think, you know, it's not, you know, you're always going to be betting on this technology development issue.
Right. Right. I've got a couple more questions actually. One is probably Mark, if you could answer this one. So the government is also investing in offshore floating wind, and there's now a consensus that renewables, is there now a consensus that renewables should be complemented by nuclear? And that's from Martin Coates. So any thoughts on balancing with renewables there?
Yeah, so I think the consensus is that there needs to be a diverse energy mix of renewables and nuclear. The Secretary of State was in front of the Base Select Committee just a couple of weeks ago, telling us that their assumptions are that nuclear will be 20% of our energy mix going forward. So, of course, as our demand increases, so will the complement of nuclear.
Okay, another question from Anonymous. So, how can new advanced nuclear technologies be more attractive to investors as a value for money proposition? And another question asking, how will the RAB model draw investment for new nuclear? What kind of organisations do you expect to invest? So from a financial perspective there, Paul, if you'd like to come in.
I can certainly have a go at the answer on the question of the regulated asset base and attracting investors. And I think the thought behind the regulated asset base is that certainly for the second nuclear project, the risks are lower than they were for the first, and it makes some sense to see whether or not we can do some things to reduce the cost of financing, to recognise that the risks are lower, and also to think about whether or not it makes more sense for the public, whether it's the taxpayer or whether it's the bill payer, to take on some of those risks rather than asking the people providing finance to take those risks. And why would the public do that? They would do that because the cost of the financing comes down further, and the cost of the power that comes out is much, much lower. And just to illustrate, about the very famous £92.50 for Hinkley Point, about 2/3 of that, so about £60 of that is the cost of financing. And that was financed with EDF and our partners taking the risk on the construction of cost overruns, of time overruns, all the delivery risks associated with it. And we only get paid when we start producing electricity. The result of that is we started the project with an expectation of a return for the project of somewhere in the region of 8 or 9%. By contrast, assets that are financed as a regulated asset structure, you talk about 4 or 5%. So you're about a half of the cost of financing as a result. So you can imagine taking some half out of the cost of that £60 if you start to think about halving the cost of financing. And if you also pay some of that money as you go during the construction phase, then there are some people like pension funds who have to rule themselves out because they can't wait until the project is finished to start getting a return. Their rules don't allow that. So if you allow some payment during the construction phase, then they are able to invest in it, and then they can take advantage of having something which is then a very long life asset that fits their investment rules, that would allow them to finance new nuclear, and then have a 60-year asset, industrial infrastructure for the UK, producing a return for them and power for consumers. So I think, exactly who might be attracted, it's those sort of people, sovereign wealth or pension funds with something like a regulated structure become potential financiers of our next wave of nuclear.
Thank you very much, Paul. And another question on kind of the economics, maybe Robin could answer this one. How do we bring the cost of decommissioning down? So maybe you could explain a bit more about the process of decommissioning, and if it is the most expensive part of the picture of nuclear, you could explain to us why, or if not, why not?
So I can explain to you what the decommissioning issue is, and actually from an historical perspective as well. But I think on the economics, probably Paul has been thinking about the economics of that part of it as well. But when we first built nuclear reactors, we had no idea what we would do with these things at the end of their lifetimes in terms of returning the sites to greenfield and thus able to be used for other things. We didn't really understand the issues of nuclear contamination of concretes, and so there's all sorts of engineering challenges that old plant had. And we probably also, I think it's fair to say, did not understand really at all about design for decommissioning. So what we are faced with at the moment in terms of decommissioning existing plant is very different from the circumstances of which you understand so much more about what you do to deconstruct your plant at the end of its lifetime. And so you design and you understand how to design for that to be able to progress in a safe, secure, but also efficient manner. Now, what typically you would want to do is collect revenue through the lifetime and operation of the plant, and you build up that revenue so that it's available for you to use for the decommissioning at the end of the lifetime. So that's the sort of ideal that you would like to do, and we see those sorts of structures in all sorts of other financial circumstances. But Paul, I don't know exactly on the decommissioning fund for the new plant, but I'm sure you do.
Yeah, I mean, Robin set it out. I mean, essentially in the £92.50 number, it's about £3 of that is money that is to be set aside during the period where the station's producing its electricity. So for every megawatt hour of electricity, £3 goes into the pot, and that pot is invested from day one. The early investments will then grow because they'll be invested, and at the end of the life, there's more than enough money expected to be there to cover the cost of decommissioning and also paying for the waste that needs to be stored for the long term in the UK's repository, to go into that repository and to pay its share of those long-term management costs. So, we've learned a lot from the legacy about a responsible cycle, putting enough money aside and doing it early. And that's already built into the arrangements for any future new nuclear stations, with lots and lots of conservatism in the cost estimates of how much it's going to cost to take the station apart and how much it's going to cost to put it down underground in the long-term waste storage. So there's lots of allowance for what if things go wrong. But the fundamental principle is we're doing it right this time.
Promising stuff. So we've got another question from Jake Tudge, and he's asked, what do the panel think the impact of the growth of the hydrogen economy will be on nuclear, both large and small? So I'll just open that up to everyone. Simon?
Sure. So I would say there's potential upsides and downsides for nuclear with regards to hydrogen. I mean, should start by saying probably that hydrogen is likely to be extremely important in getting to net zero for the UK and globally, but probably not for all of the sectors that people commonly imagine hydrogen would play a role in. And so it may be a more limited, albeit perhaps even vital role, perhaps smaller than people imagine. Now, in terms of what it means for nuclear, I mean, so we've talked. The UK has this net zero by 2050 target, but on the way to that, we want to get to net zero electricity by 2035. That's quite soon, and we've been talking about nuclear, but ultimately there are alternatives to that. And some of the nuclear options are unproven in terms of SMRs and AMRs, as are some of the alternative firm low carbon options, whether that's hydrogen power, gas CCS, specs, and so on. So if one potential upside for nuclear would be producing hydrogen, and then backing up wind and solar when it isn't producing hydrogen. That's certainly a role that it could play. But on the other hand, if we generate lots of hydrogen from excess renewables, then that might reduce the need for nuclear by providing an alternative low carbon backup.
Thank you very much, Simon.
Rebecca, can I just add on that one? I mean, I agree with Simon that it's a big but uncertain role for hydrogen going forward. We've looked a lot at the opportunities for hydrogen because, of course, we produce low carbon electricity today that could be used to produce low carbon hydrogen via electrolysis. We're building in options on Sizewell C to allow some of the heat, not as hot as Robin talks about in some of the very high temperature reactors, but even from something like Sizewell C, you could take some of that heat and use that to help the electrolytic production of hydrogen. We also know actually that Sizewell is going to need quite a big bus and construction fleet. So maybe there's an opportunity to use hydrogen to power some of that construction stage, and so take carbon out of the construction of the nuclear power station. And then, of course, for the longer term, Robin talked about the role that high temperature nuclear reactors can play, producing hydrogen, producing it directly by cracking the water without the same use of electricity. And in all of that, there's an opportunity for nuclear to be part of the narrative. As Simon said, it may be that actually some of that hydrogen then becomes a useful way of keeping the system in balance. And what we don't then do is use nuclear to do some of that flexibility balancing itself, but it does it from having produced the hydrogen in the first place. It's all part of thinking about a future energy system. And that I think was a really important thought from Robin, is that we need to think about this in terms of what the system is going to look like on the steps on the way, and then how we use wind and solar and low carbon gas and nuclear and all of the other technologies and storage in that system.
Thank you very much. Another question similar, but taking the example of how the government is investing in battery manufacturing. So we've just backed Britishvolt. So what about the mass adoption of EVs? And we can store electricity in the battery. I wonder if, Mark, maybe you could come in and explain why it's important for us to be also developing battery manufacturing and whether that undermines nuclear in any way.
Rebecca, sorry, I was just concentrating on votes there. Apologise. Could you just repeat the question? Because I thought it was about using EV batteries for storage.
Yeah. What about storing energy in our batteries? How will that balance our grid? And the government's backing all sorts of different ways of storing energy. So, what role do you think battery manufacturing is going to play?
So yeah, I think we'll move in significant quantities, as is currently government policy, to certainly to zero emissions at the tailpipe. But that will be significant quantities of electric vehicles. I have access to two. I love electric cars. Do I want the grid taking energy out of my battery? I mean, that's something that we're going to have to deal with when that, the smart chargers are set up, is my understanding, to be and smart meters to be able to do that. But I think, given an option, most people would turn that ability off. There are of course options for selling electricity back to the grid at some times through some of these sort of octopus tariffs. We also do the same with Tesla Powerwalls and things like that. So when I mentioned the smart grid, the ability to store and release and also to alter charging dependent on charging rates, dependent on grid requirements, that's exactly what I was alluding to. But there's a really careful conversation to be had with consumers as to how that's managed, and indeed whether we, the costs we pay for some of that.
Thank you. And Robin, you would like to come in?
Yeah, no, I thought that was a really interesting comment, because there was all sorts of human factor stuff going on there that Mark was talking about. And, he's saying, would I want people to take electricity out of my battery? And, he was hesitant about that. And I absolutely understand that. But what I would say to him is, would you like them to take electricity out your battery for this amount of money or that amount of money? So I think everybody will have a limit in a smart grid where they will go, well, I don't want to have electricity taken out at this cost point, but I would definitely let them take it out at this cost point. And so people will be choosing as individuals, and what we'll have to do is understand the human factors and the way that people think about this, and that is part of the systems engineering approach, in fact, to understand people's attitudes and try and get them to commit to the overall solution. I think batteries are going to be definitely part of it, but like the pump storage, well, not quite like the pump storage, but batteries are not cheap. They aren't a cheap option, and they aren't as environmentally benign, I think, as they are always thought of. And so I can easily see batteries playing in a very important part when demands fluctuate quite a lot. But in terms of storage of electricity that you need for, say, like we have over the last 48 hours. I mean, it's a bit unusual, but nevertheless, the last 48 hours where we've been utterly dominated by gas, we would have to be utterly dominated by storage, and that's a lot of storage.
Just if I may, just to add on that point, I mean, I think electric vehicles are a really exciting opportunity for consumers to engage differently and to take those decisions, as Robin said, about, am I willing to change the time I charge to make a saving on the price that I charge at, and am I willing to sell back at this price or that price? I think, though, that the thing that we mustn't forget, living in the UK and being in winter at the moment, is that the thing that the system engineers have to think about is something the Germans call the Dunkelflaut, which our translation, I think, is the cold, dark winter doldrums. So it's the week, 2 week wind lull when our demand for energy is high. And the bit I can't imagine is all the car drivers saying, you can take the power out today, but I can't charge my car up for 2 weeks. I can imagine them saying, I'll defer the time I charge, or let it be a bit more run down tonight. But we, from the systems point of view, have to think about that 2 week period and make sure that we don't run out of power for that.
Simon, would you like to come in?
Yeah, just quite briefly, really. I think the way to think about this is about different timescales that we need storage for.
Yes.
So batteries and EVs is about balancing the grid, supply and demand on the timescale of seconds, minutes, hours, perhaps out to half a day or a day. Anything beyond that, you need much greater storage capacity in terms of the amount of energy. Pump storage isn't the answer to that. Really, it's molecules. Typically, you're thinking about things like hydrogen or gas or biomass or nuclear. It's things that they need to be flexible options, obviously, but they need to be able to last for weeks at a time.
Rebecca, can I ask Simon a question?
Of course.
Because he's talking about molecules, and I absolutely find this fascinating. Simon, what do you think about a green jet fuel for sort of powering transatlantic flights and things like that? So the longer than the 200 miles, 400 miles that you might be able to do with the new battery planes. Do you think that's a really realistic?
I mean, the thermodynamics doesn't stack up very well. But on the other hand, fossil fuel combustion is pretty inefficient. So it's a question of what are your options. As you've mentioned, batteries probably aren't up to transatlantic flights for many hundreds of passengers.
No.
What are the alternatives? You're looking at maybe hydrogen, but you probably have to redesign your jet jet plane,
Yeah,
or
that's
you're
really
maybe,
hard.
or you're looking at permanently running a negative emissions industry to offset the emissions. So there aren't any great options for airplanes.
No, fascinating, isn't it? So that's a really interesting problem, actually. Sorry.
We've got another question that I could pose to the panel, please. Do you see the role of nuclear being critical in being able to support grid stability through inertia in a world where we want to reduce unabated gas? Robin, you have any thoughts on that?
So grid inertia, did you say?
Yes. So I think so maybe when the grid is stable, or
yeah, I think Simon probably has thought about this more than me.
It looks like Paul might have something to say, but just
sorry.
I mean, yeah, go ahead, Paul.
I think one of the things that we are seeing, and it's something that we've taken for granted in the UK, is that when we have had a system with some very big old coal units and nuclear units, those things are spinning at 50 hertz all the time, and if there's a frequency excursion, it's very easily addressed by the existing big chunks of spinning iron, and we've largely taken that for granted. As the coal stations have come off, we've started to see that the UK grid system is a little bit more prone to the frequency moving around, and the question is, how does the grid system and the system operator design a future system? There are synthetic ways of doing it, but it is true that big nuclear stations are a useful and helpful contributor because they're spinning all the time, so they do provide that inertia. You can do it in other ways, and there's some very interesting work going on about whether or not offshore wind can provide some inertia services to the grid as well. There's work going on around the world on that, but it's something that we do need because we're very reliant on the stability of our grid. We are a small island, not connected at the same frequency as the rest of the continent, so a lot of the continental Europe can rely on each other to stay inside the boundaries. We're slightly different, and we have to be more thoughtful about this, and there's work ongoing to think and to act on that.
What I would say, though, just to my sort of take on inertia as a problem, is it's something that gives grid engineers nightmares to think about how they're going to manage it. But I also think this isn't necessarily a sort of detailed, very informed view, but having spoken to people over the years, my sense is that grid engineers have nightmares about this, but they're also very ingenious and they're good at coming up with solutions to this type of technical problem. I think there are options out there, and of all of the the factors about designing that net zero energy system, I wouldn't say this is the one that worries me the most.
Thank you very much.
If you're Fintan Sly, it might be something that causes you to be slightly nervous running the system operator through the next decade. I think that's. But there are some great engineers who hopefully will find great solutions.
And there's another question. I think, Mark, if I could pose this one to you, please. How does the UK's nuclear strategy compare to other countries? Are we leading development or catching up with others who have proven that the future of nuclear is fundamental?
Good question. So we're in a very similar position to a number of different countries, I would say. China has been building nuclear for some time. Korea continues to build. There are other countries that are moving away from nuclear, such as Germany, but also becoming some of the highest polluters in Europe on the back of it, some of the highest emitters from energy, I should probably term it. But we're certainly there at the front. France has now committed to small modular, and I think possibly 6 new power stations across France gets a significant portion of its energy because they were ahead of us in building some decades ago. They get a large portion of their energy from nuclear, because we benefit from that currently through interconnectors. And you'll see the grid carbon intensity is much lower in in France because of it. We're certainly at the front of the pack, but as we're certainly in the front of the pack, but not at the front, I think is my perception.
Okay, and Paul, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I mean, as Mark said, I mean, the UK has been, in Western Europe, it was one of the countries that was, at the forefront as we went through some of the debates on Hinkley Point. At that stage, I think we were ahead. More recently, I see quite a lot of Western and Eastern European countries reaching a similar conclusion. There are debates at the moment in Holland, in Poland, as Mark said, in France as well. Lots of countries are, as they think about net zero, are reaching this same conclusion. And I think the question for the UK is not a question of, are we at the ahead today? It's, can we stay where we want to be, given that there are some others who may be accelerating? And if we don't do something, will we get overtaken?
Just a point on that. We all need to get to net zero globally. So if nuclear is expensive and difficult, it requires skilled workers and engineering. What are we going to do? How could we help countries overseas, or do we see ourselves helping other countries overseas developing their nuclear industry, so that it's not just the UK and wealthy countries achieving net zero, that it's actually possible in other places such as the African continent? Anyone?
So we are actually already doing some work there through the IAEA. Certainly, the first thing you need to do is ensure that there is the right degree of education, so that people are able to build up their own indigenous capabilities and understanding, so that they can, even if they're not going to be manufacturing reactors themselves, they are, properly informed customers, and they understand what the issues are, and also that they can develop their own regulator. So we work through the IAEA, through their education department in particular, to try to help a whole variety of different countries achieve that. That's one thing, and I'll let others have a go.
If I could just jump in there. I've made the point to anyone that will listen in government that exactly as you say, Rebecca, that we all need to get to net zero. The UK doing that in isolation is futile. But what we cannot do, and we've stopped the financing of coal power projects abroad as well, and even stopped financing of oil and gas projects that don't have a proven reduction in emissions, for example. What we need to do, no one has yet leapfrogged our path to prosperity through burning wood, coal, oil, gas onto nuclear. We can't expect others to do that. So what we should be doing is using our UK SMR, for example, our supply chain, our overseas development funding to enable those countries to reach net zero, to leapfrog those other technologies, while also getting to net zero, while enhancing our nuclear supply chain and seeing the benefits of that spending here at home as well.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Paul, do you have any thoughts on overseas development?
I mean, just, I guess, to add a couple of observations, if I may. The first one is, I mean, Robin talked about the IAEA programs. I mean, clearly the International Atomic Energy Authority has an important role making sure that it's only the right places in the world get access to the nuclear technologies, which is one of the dimensions of it, but they also play this important role helping develop the regulatory capability in countries where they are taking nuclear forward. I mean, we shouldn't go back to Robin's point about the fact we've got a brilliant nuclear regulator here. We've got decades of experience a great regulatory scheme and people who are helping some of those countries around the world. We've also got some great engineering companies in the nuclear supply chain who are out there helping. And we're as EDF certainly involved in helping with the operation of some of the countries that are more recent nuclear players at the moment. So the United Arab Emirates, as an example, are drawing on some people who have UK heritage to make sure that they're out there knowing how to run those stations with the right focus on safety, the right focus on the long-term operation of the stations. And that's another area of export skills. It's not just by selling kit or by selling designs, it's by selling our expertise in the whole life cycle of nuclear power stations, including actually at the end of their life in the decommissioning is where there's an opportunity for the UK.
Thank you very much. I've got a couple more questions which I'd like to pose to everyone on the panel, if they could maybe choose which one they want to answer, or maybe both. So the first one is on uranium. How much do we need of uranium? And is it a common element? And where do we get it? Is it found in the UK? So that's the first question. And the second question is around waste. How are we handling nuclear waste? How do we know it's going to be a sustainable solution? So if I could maybe start with Mark.
So on waste, the waste from a nuclear, so there's a couple of different waste issues in the UK at the minute, and I see that firsthand. It's in my neighbouring constituency. Sellafield was where I was at prior to coming to Parliament, and I think there's a big misconception that what is at Sellafield is the waste from nuclear power stations, when that a lot of it is from weapons programs and other things. And I think it was alluded to before, not knowing exactly how best to deal with and store it, and those are problems that we've since overcome. So the waste from nuclear power stations is actually quite small by comparison to what we hold of all our nuclear inventory. And of course, we are looking for a geological disposal facility for long-term disposal of that, a number of places in the running. And the first question on uranium is probably best handled by somebody else. I know that we've closed our fuel reprocessing plants because it is much easier to buy new as it is at the minute, and I don't know what the figure looks like to make it worthwhile to start reprocessing again.
Thank you very much, Mark. If I could go to Simon, please.
Yeah, I'm actually going to pass pretty much on both of these. I did study chemistry at university, but I can't tell you much about uranium. I think it's one of those ones where people sometimes worry about, are we going to run out of it? But as far as I'm aware, that's not a serious concern. In terms of waste, we've been trying to work out what to do with our long-term waste for a long time. We haven't yet come up with a solution. But in terms of the volumes that we're talking about, I think Robin alluded to this already. We created a very big mess in the early years of the nuclear industry and military usage as well in this country and in other places. And that's like the big part of dealing with our nuclear waste problem is that historical issue. And what we would be incrementally adding by building a new generation of nuclear reactors in the UK is small relative to that problem.
Thank you very much. If I could go to Robin then.
I was just trying to look up the uranium spot price, actually, but I'm afraid I wasn't quick enough. I'm not very good at this. The largest reserves are in Australia. The largest producer for a long, long time was Canada. I think that is currently overtaken by Kazakhstan as the largest producer, but actually has got quite definitively the third sort of amount. Uranium is actually not that uncommon, but unfortunately the ore bodies that it comes from generally tend to be relatively lower than other elements, because uranium is fairly reactive, and so it's the rocks that it gets incorporated in, it gets incorporated at slightly lower levels, but there is plenty of it. We don't have very much at all in the UK. We actually have quite a lot of different sorts of minerals, but uranium isn't really one of them. It's not a concern at the moment, but of course, if everybody ended up producing the majority of their energy from nuclear, which of course isn't going to happen, then of course we would actually run out of it eventually, and we would have to think about how you would recycle it, or how you would use it much more efficiently, because actually we don't use it that efficiently in ordinary fuel cycles that have been predominant at the moment. And I'll stop there and let somebody else have a go.
Thank you. Paul, please.
Yeah, no, I mean, Robin said a lot of what I was going to. I mean, there's plenty of decades of known reserves in known places for uranium, and you know, it's if the price rises, the expectation is there are plenty of other places to go looking for it.
Oh, yeah.
Not least, ultimately, in seawater, where there is a proportion that can be extracted as well. So, you know, it's decades to hundreds of years of uranium availability. I was going to make the point that when we finish using it in one of our reactors, we've used about 3% of the energy that would be available. So there's another 90% that at the moment what we do is we're going to take it and put it into this place for safe storage. If ever we're running short, the question of could we not take it back out and recycle it and get some more energy out of it becomes you know, the next question to ask. So I don't think there are things to worry about. When it comes to management of the waste, I mean, clearly the question then is the question of it's a much smaller volume than we're talking about. If we're talking about, you know, by comparison, the amount of carbon dioxide that needs to be captured and managed that we're throwing up into the atmosphere at the moment. But we still need to do what has been done, I think, better in some of the Scandinavian countries so far, which is to find the communities that are willing volunteers to host that final management siting. And you know, we know it can be done technically. We know it can be done politically because we've seen it being done in Sweden and in Finland. The UK is on with its programme to find our long-term site for storage. We're storing it safely in the meantime, so it's not a today problem, but it is a problem that we need to make progress on in order to have, you know, the full story as clean as it can be.
Thank you very much. Well, we're kind of out of time now, although we have had such a rich and insightful conversation. So thank you so much to the panelists for joining me today and answering all those questions. I'd also just like to say thank you very much to EDF for this partnership. And thank you to our online audience. I know you're out there because we've received lots of questions. So thank you very much for everyone attending today. And I hope we'll have more discussions very soon on this topic, as it is going to be of high importance over the next few years at least. So thank you very much, and I hope everyone has a lovely evening, and feel free to email me with any further questions you'd like. Thank you.